Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. This set of lessons will cover Chapter 13, Stress, Coping, and Health, and we will incorporate a portion of Chapter 9 related to emotions. This lesson focuses on the nature of stress. This will continue our examination of the biopsychosocial model of human behavior that we have been investigating since finishing Chapter 2. So we're going to be looking at stress, and every year the American Psychological Association does a survey in the United States of stress. And on this slide we have the results of their studies from 2007 to 2012. So one good thing that you can see in this particular graphic is that stress seems to be getting a little bit better. People are feeling less stressed than they were in 2007. But their perceived level of healthy stress has always been below what their stress level actually is. And so we need to take a look at stress and how it can affect our health. Now, in terms of stress, what we're going to focus on are situations that the individual feels are threatening their well-being and taxing their ability to cope. So this means that not every person is going to perceive every circumstance as stressful. Now, the types of circumstances that people view as stressful could be events, things that actually are happening to you, such as your house burning down. Or they could be non-events, and these would be things that you were hoping were going to happen that didn't actually happen. So for example, not getting the job that you were hoping to get. Stress can also come from things that are viewed as both pleasant and unpleasant. So just because it's a good thing happening in your life, like getting that job that you were hoping for, doesn't mean there's not also stress that goes along with it. Another aspect of stress that's very interesting is how we view the types of stressors that we encounter in our day-to-day lives. So typically, when a big thing happens in your life, like a disaster, you recognize that this is a source of stress. So your house burning down would be a disaster, and you would recognize right away that you needed to do something to cope with this particular situation. But if we look at the kinds of things that actually are most damaging to our health, they're actually everyday events, those little things that you encounter day in and day out. Things that all by themselves really aren't that hard to deal with. I can deal with a bill. I can deal with, my car not starting, and I can call somebody and get a ride, and that's okay. But when these things start to pile up, what we see is that all of these sort of routine day in and day out things that we encounter can actually be just as damaging, if not more damaging, than a big event in your life. And so what we find is that stressors sort of accumulate. You sort of take them on your back, you throw them over your shoulder, and you hunch down and you keep going until eventually you hit the one that breaks the camel's back. The story I like to tell in my face-to-face classes is about my mom. And we had 5 kids in our family. We lived 13 miles out of town down a very rough, rocky, gravelly country road. We had a car that was not very reliable, so we all used to say a little prayer before she started it just to hope that we could get where we needed to go. At the time of this story, my youngest brother was a baby, and so he would get strapped in his car seat anytime we had to go anywhere, and he absolutely hated it. So one day she had to go grocery shopping, which meant loading up the car with all 5 kids. As soon as we got in the car, my younger brother started screaming, and the 4 older kids had a technique for dealing with this. We would sing, only we were not very good singers, so we would essentially scream, and we didn't know a whole lot of songs, so usually we would scream Christmas carols. Now this was July. So my mom is driving down a gravelly, dusty country road in a car without air conditioning in July with a baby screaming and her 4 other children yelling Christmas carols at him. Well, we made it to the store somehow, and then we had to go grocery shopping with 5 kids. So if you've ever been in the store and seen someone shopping with a large group of kids, you probably know how this went. So there was lots of yelling and put that down and stop touching her and come over here and stop this and stop that. And we weren't really very rich, and so it was kind of a challenge to try to make those grocery dollars stretch and make sure we had enough money to buy all the groceries. So somehow my mom managed to get everything we needed and have the money to pay for it. We got the groceries in the car, and then we went to go home, which was basically a repeat of our drive to the store with the baby screaming, the rest of us yelling, and the heat. We finally arrived back home, and we carried the groceries in and we're putting them away. And one of my brothers was kind of being cute and was swinging his arms carrying a gallon of milk over to the refrigerator. Well, it slipped out of his hands, went flying through the air, and when it hit that hard kitchen floor, it burst open. And so there was a gallon of milk everywhere. And my mom, who had held it together throughout everything, just sat down in a kitchen chair and cried. Now, if you were to walk in and just see this woman literally crying over spilt milk, you may not understand all of the accumulated stress that day had piled on her. She wasn't really crying over the spilt milk. She was crying over the entire day. And the milk was just the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, if you were to walk in and see this situation, you probably would not be very empathetic. You would probably kind of say, what are you doing? Get up and clean up the milk. You know, this is just silly. You're crying over spilt milk. Now imagine if a disaster were to happen. So if I were to come home after work one day and find that my house had burned down while I was gone, would my neighbors walk over and say, what is wrong with you? You're crazy. You should just buck up and start rebuilding your house. Or do you think that I would get some empathy and support? In fact, the Red Cross would show up. I would call my family. My mom would fly in. It would be a big deal, and I would rally a lot of support. And I would recognize, okay, this is something big that I have to cope with. So another problem with this sort of accumulated nature of stress is other people, and also sometimes ourselves, don't even recognize that we're stressed until we break down. So we've been talking about what are potentially stressful events. So things that happen or don't happen, and they're neither good nor bad, and they can be major or minor events, but those hassles that accumulate, those day in and day out stressors, can often be worse. Now, a lot of times, when we recognize that we are responding to that stress, when I'm having that overwhelmed feeling, when I'm sitting and crying over spilt milk, I will try to find the cause of that, and a lot of times we point to the events as the cause. But what psychologists, particularly Albert Ellis, has found is that those events are not the direct cause for the consequences that we see. Actually, those events get filtered through our belief system. And depending on how I interpret that event, what I say to myself about that situation, my reaction could be very different. And so we call these filters our cognitive appraisals. Our cognitive appraisals are the things that you say to yourself inside your head about whether or not the situation is threatening or harmless. If it's harmless, there's no stress. If we decide it's threatening, then we decide, can we deal with this? Can we cope with this? Or are we feeling overwhelmed? This isn't something I have the skills to or the ability to deal with right now. And so it turns out that the types of things you say to yourself have a big impact on your stress. We can't always do something about the events, but we can do something about our appraisal of those events. And it turns out that saying alarming things to ourselves about what happens in our lives makes our stress worse. So the key here is to be realistic and reassuring. So what we like to say is that stress lies in the eye of the beholder. So whatever you see when you look at those events, whatever you say to yourself about those events affects what your ultimate reaction will be.